your comments that you sent me as the basis of that, right? And there's plenty to talk about that way, even without getting to the landscapes yet. So I think what we'll do is Rembrandt prints today and Friday, talk about the landscapes on Friday, talk about the other prints you guys chose today, and sort of give them some context, right? But these are the ones that you said you really liked, and therefore I think these are things you might want to hear more about. Obviously, this ain't Rembrandt, but we left off talking about Goltzius from the print room that people had chosen, right? Was one of the prints that people had said that they liked from the print room. And we hadn't really looked at him next to Dürer, right? That's who he's trying to look like, is Dürer, right? So remember that this is in the manner of Dürer's print. And you can see all these little things, right? The light coming through the window over here is emulating this. And if you just pull out a magnifying glass and put these things side by side, is the way he does those really regular cross-hatchings rather than his calligraphic style, right? Is really similar to what we see here. The face of Saint Jerome. Saint Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, right? Took all the different translations and figured out, sort of corrected people's grammar, right, in the translations. But if you look at his face and look at his face, right, they're really similar. And then even just little things like the little tick marks that he includes are very, very similar here. And right down to the way he signs it. There's Dürer's signature on a tablet laying on the ground, and Goltzius looks just like it, right? So it's utter emulation, but at the same time what Goltzius is doing is he's proving himself, right, as being the greatest printmaker that ever lived in a way. And I kind of agree with him. I used to think Goltzius was sort of a second-tier guy, but boy, the more I look at him, the more I think that this is really as good as... I mean, I love Dürer, don't get me wrong, but Goltzius is extraordinary. And when Van Mander wrote a biography of him, right, his friend, he said that he was a Proteus, that's the Greek god that can shift shapes, right? And that he could be anything he wanted to be. He could just change his style at the drop of a hat. And what we saw with Dina's painting is I could even just drop all of this. And maybe it's arthritis. We don't know, right? Why, at the end of his life, for the last 15 years, he decided to paint instead of print make. But he gave it up altogether, even though he's as good as anybody breathing at the time, and starts to paint. And some people think it might have just been, that bad eyesight, right? Arthritis, back problems. If you're hunched over something like that, you can imagine what it's going to be like after a while. But of course, there's the other thing that we know definitely is true, and in Goltzius' mind is the nobility of art. And painting is a much more noble pursuit for an artist. It's much more lofty. It has much more status than printmaking does. And Goltzius is definitely interested in the status of printmaking. But certainly then turns to painting, and that we can't discount that might have been why. Right? Olivia, who's not here, which is odd because she came to my office this morning, chose Sagers as her favorite print from the print room. And I thought we'd just look at these and these are extraordinary things. They're so weird. They're so modern. They look like something from the early 20th century. They look like a symbolist work. And it's almost as if Goltzius sees the power of nature in a way, and he understands sort of not how nature looks so much as how nature works. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, he's giving us how moss grows off the tree, rather than how moss might actually look, even though it still looks like moss. Maeve? Yeah, this is a copperplate etching. Yeah. And we're still in the dark as to how he did these things. He seems to have had some secrets and some experimental techniques. It's on hand-tinted paper as well, right? So he painted the paper. And he was known to paint a number of his works. So the blues and grays that you see in the pink is all hand-painted. But the ink that you're looking at here is transferred from the copperplate. You can see how deeply etched it is by how, remember we were next to a window when we saw this, and how the ink is actually catching the light from the window on the side of it, so it stands up on the surface. And that's true of any intaglio print. Intaglio is the term we use for prints where you cut the lines rather than relief prints. That's not going to help, right, with the glue stick? Right, it's so thick and inky. And this is an interesting thing. This came out of the Rembrandt House talk. Remember that printmaking ink, and I remember this when I was a printmaker, they talk about the difference between, my printmaking prof talked about the difference between the kind of ink you use on a wood block, which is closer to oil paint, and the kind of ink you use in an intaglio print. So intaglio is this Italian word, I-N-T-A-G, silent G, L-I-O, intaglio. And that refers to the process of cutting the lines into which you rub the ink, right? And you polish it off the flat surfaces. Whereas a relief print, you carve away the white bits and you just roll the ink across the top, right? And relief print is so much easier because you don't need to press, right? You just put a piece of paper on it and rub it, and you get the ink transferred. And the ink in a relief print is rubberier. It's like it's got gluten almost. It wants to hold together. It stretches, right? Like oil paint can. You can pull oil paint across the surface very thinly, right? Whereas intaglio ink is more like clay, right? Rather than taffy. That's how he explained it. Taffy for relief print ink because it spreads over the surface. And I want to see you write with it like that. That would be the trick for you to figure. And intaglio ink is more like clay, in that when you pull it, it doesn't stretch, it pulls apart. It breaks up, right? It has a sort of sandy type consistency, right? It will definitely pull apart. And so, Maeve, your issue about how thick the paint is, that's because it's got that glommy intaglio ink kind of thing. You can't use printmaking ink on intaglio plate because it's impossible to wipe it out clean. Because when you rub your hand across it, right, and you're polishing off the flat surface and you're leaving the ink inside the lines, right, you need the ink to want to break apart, right, and stay in the lines. The other stuff to come off on your hand and you wipe it on your hands, right, or your apron. Hopefully, my pants, right. And I get a feeling that's why I got psoriasis, because this stuff is really bad for you. Okay, so it pulls apart. We heard at the Rembrandt House that sandy, gritty texture is maybe why the plates wear down over time. Right? Now, in this case, the question is how do you get the line, right? That's the big issue with etching. With intaglio prints is how you get the line. So Goltzi has carved it, right? He's got the burin, he's going in there and carving it, right? Primarily, and that's the older school tradition. That goes back to metal workers in the Middle Ages, carving little designs on armor that you would wear in a parade, right? And we think that's how printmaking got started in the first place, is they were making these designs in armor. They wanted to see how good the design was, and so they would rub some ink into it and pull a print off of it and see what it looked like, right? Before they became independent works of art. In the middle of the 16th century, actually early part, the first experiments in etching. Dürer experiments with etching, but only does like one or two. And by the end of the 16th century, we start to see etching become more and more developed, and it replaces engraving as the primary intaglio printmaking style or technique. And the reason that artists turn to etching is it allows more freedom of sketch. You can open up, and it goes hand in hand with the development of the Baroque style, where things are more expressive, right? And so what etching is you cover the plate with a thin layer of wax, right? Usually mixed with a few other chemicals to make it spread thinly, right? But it's wax. And like wax, it has a melting temp, right? And so you add something that kind of raises the melting temp a little bit, turns it, and allows you to spread it really thin. It also colors it a bit, right? So you know what you've got. And so you take this copper plate, and you cover it with the wax. Have I gone over this before? Is it worth going over again? Yeah? I'm into it, right?
I mean, I like halfway there, same as it's finished.
Okay, very good. So you scratch through it, right? And then you put it in the acid bath, okay? Now you've obviously got to have something on the back of it. And the wax has to be heated up to smooth out, right? Not high heat, we used a hot plate, he used a candle, right? And then once you've got it drawn, you take the whole thing and put it in acid, right? A fairly mild acid. You wouldn't want it in your mouth, and you wouldn't want it in your eyes, and you wouldn't want it in an open cut. But you wouldn't take it won't take the skin off your finger, right? You put your hand in it. And it's not like Breaking Bad, right? The tubs in the basement in Breaking Bad or anything like that, right? It's not going to just pull the skin. So that gets applied to the plate, or the plate gets applied into a bath, right? And then you pull it out, and then you clean the wax off, and then you rub the ink into it. Couple of things that we know that are different about the modern day, because Maeve probably has just started this. Mary's teaching acid etching, copper plate etching, here on campus. We're using very non-toxic chemicals, right? Different ones than Rembrandt and Sagers were using. But one of the things we know from looking at the prints themselves is that Rembrandt would have built up a little wax wall around the edge of the plate and simply poured the acid into this nifty little pool he's made. Whereas we have a plastic vat that we stick the plate into, right? The other thing that we know about both Rembrandt, we think, and certainly about Sagers, is that there are these other techniques that they're using to bear the plate, right? And one of the techniques that Sagers might have used is what we call sugar lift, right? And I mentioned this briefly in the Rijksmuseum, but it's what you do is you take, before you put the wax down, a mixture of sugar and water, and you heat it up and you make a syrup, right? You can paint onto the plate. And when it dries, right, it'll have this glummy slug trails, right, from sugar. And then you put the wax over the top of it, and then you put it in hot water, and the sugar lifts right through the wax and bears the plate. And you end up getting, so etching allows you to sketch, and sugar lift allows you to paint, right, paint lines. So this looks to me like a sugar lift, right? Because those areas have not been drawn with what appears to be a point. They seem to be painted on, right? That's one possibility. The other thing that we know from recipe books is that they could actually add stuff to the acid to thicken it, and then just paint the acid right on the plate, right? Because the basic issue is, the basic thing about printmaking is that any variation on the flat surface will produce a print. Anything that varies from perfectly smooth will produce a print, right? So all you've got to do is alter that plate somehow, right? That's and with some sort of design. So how you do it is anybody's business, right? I mentioned before, like, put it down and have the horse step on it, you know? That would produce an alteration to the surface of the plate that you could then print, right? So this may be coming in with that thick, gooey, acid-based mixture right under the plate, allowing it to just sit there, right? No wax whatsoever. And then you sort of hit it with some water, neutralize it when you're done, and you've got the lines. We don't have the plates, so it's hard to say how we got those lines. You have to look at the edges of these things, right? But there's such a drippiness to it, right? And it's such a cool, I mean, these are such cool prints, and they're so rare. There's some Sagers here in the NGA, right? But he's really extraordinary in sort of this expressionistic quality that looks almost abstract. They don't look like 20th century prints, or excuse me, they don't look like 17th century prints. They look like 20th century prints. And then this hand tinting. And remember that Rembrandt had one of his plates, had a Sagers plate, and probably collected these things. And there's a lot of debate over the degree to which Rembrandt's approach to printmaking is influenced by this sort of experimental approach that Sagers, prior to Rembrandt, was really extolling, right? And just some nice details of the paper, right, here. Because my camera got in pretty close. Let's see. Matt chose this one, which we can see also the great thing that Sagers can do. And these, I think, are drawn, right? The lines are. But they still have that same strange sort of aqueous wandering quality. And again, that thorny tree stump in the corner looks so much like a drawing out of a children's book or something. They're modern children's book. I think it's terrific, right? But also the degree to which he sees every single impression as being unique, rather than, because what a print can do is give you 100 of exactly the same thing, right? That's what a print can do. Give you hundreds of exactly the same image with no variation whatsoever. But Sagers doesn't see it that way. He sees each and every impression coming off of this thing as having its own vibrancy and life, right? And he adds to that through various things. And what an amazing change it has on the feeling of that matrix when he adds color and shadow, right, to the different areas. And obviously he loves moss, and he loves these sort of craggy rocks. And then he also loves coming back into them and altering them. And also printing on alternative surfaces, right? Not just printing on paper, but also printing on cloth, right? This is a piece of linen that he's painted on as well, or printed on, that is, and then hand tinted after it's been printed. And Rembrandt, later in his career, starts to begin to play with different kinds of papers, right? It's not just strict traditional European handmade paper, but he gets Asian papers made from oatmeal, and he gets animal skins, right? Parchment, which is not uncommon. A lot of books are written on parchment, vellum, right? He never does hand tinting, and he never does linen. So he doesn't do exactly what Sagers did. But if we, again, think about how it's the idea and what you do with it, right? Seems to follow very strongly in the footsteps of Sagers. Maybe. I watercolor paints. I don't. You'd have to. I would imagine all we'd have to do is go grab. There was a big Sagers show about 5 years ago, and then there was a huge catalog in the '80s written on him. And all you have to do is go find. There's a curator that'll tell, or a conservator will tell you exactly what kind of tint they use here. My guess is that they're water based, and the reason I say that is that printer's ink is oil based, and so if you're going to come over the top of it with something, it's probably not another oil based paint. Right, and that will then allow it to stain into the fabric. And the way having looked at this in person, and you can even see this, I think, on a certain level here. Well, let's look at the next detail, right? The way some of it looks opaque, right? Especially along the light along the horizon seems to sit on top of that yellow, which suggests to me gouache, right? Which is an opaque water-based paint. Rather than a translucent watercolor, right? That's what I'm thinking he's using. That's just my guess from looking, but I would then trust the people who've taken paint samples and analyzed them. Although on something like this, you'd have to be unlike a painting, you couldn't hide it, right? You're extraordinarily careful about doing something like that. Finally, Shelley chose one of these, right? One of the great treats was to see how Rembrandt, learning from that model of Sagers, took one print and did so much with it, right? To the point that every one of these really seems almost like a different image, even though they're all using the same matrix that we saw on the left, right? Just as wiping techniques. Because, again, if we keep in mind the tradition that anything not only any variation to the surface of the plate will print, but also anything on the surface of that plate will print, right? And that means if you don't wipe all the ink off, you can make creative individual works, right? I guess if you got into it, you could have hand-colored parts of it if you wanted to, right? And rubbed colored inks into certain areas versus some other areas if you wanted to. He never did that, right? But he did play with surface qualities, different kinds of papers and whatnot, and he also played with different rubbing techniques. Okay. Wi-Fi. There we go. Right? And so you can see the difference in this. And I think I was talking, we were looking at the thickness of the ink, right? And how when you look at the crosshatch that makes up the areas over here, and he worked this through multiple, I just love looking at these because you can see him at work. You know, all of those diagonals that come in first, and then these wonderful, this is what etching allows you to do. Right? Just squiggle your line down like that. Where you could never have done that if the Goltzius, right? It's impossible to get a line that gives you that, right? Anywhere. Or even just this sort of wonderful, simple outline for the beard of Simeon, you know. Such a great draftsman and so confident. Anyway, he built this up again and again and again, and some of the later impressions have a huge lattice work of lines up here that now is also sort of filled with ink, and the surface becomes this texture of ink lines, right? And if we're lucky enough on some Rembrandts, and I can't tell you where they are, they're all over the place, but you look at enough of them long enough, and every now and then you'll find a little white line because one of his beard hairs fell out and landed on the plate before he put the paper down, right? And end up getting in the way, like blocked out something, right? It's all part of the process, right? And each one of these ends up as a total life of its own, right? And allows him to focus on different parts. So in this case, it's the upper body of Christ. Even though it's the same matrix each time, right? Extraordinary things, right? And that allows us sort of to begin our discussion of Rembrandt as a printmaker a bit more fully than we have with the things that you guys chose. So I just brought this one in because he's drawing, we think, although I like to think of him as the etcher here, even though he's working on paper out by this open window. This print actually got worked through about 6 or 7 states, and the first one he had the eyeballs off. They were like really weird. You look at like state number 1, and it's a Rembrandt on a Monday, right? Having a really bad Monday, unable to draw his own eyes properly, and then he burnished it out and fixed it as well. So what did you guys choose that you liked? Jorge liked this one, right? This is the one you wanted because there's 2 of these, right? The Raising of Lazarus. And so I thought I'd just bring them in, and these are the ones you guys chose from the print side of all the Rembrandt show. This is a great print, and it raises an interesting issue for Rembrandt. And that is that in the 1630s, right? So remember his biography, right? 1630s moved from Leiden to Amsterdam. He's starting his career as a professional artist, and he's really sort of keen on this idea of greatness, right? He's really ambitious. And one of the things we see him do, he starts etching when he's already in Leiden, right? But he really gets into it when he moves to Amsterdam. And this print's particularly large, right? It's about like yay, which for a piece of copper that had to be hand flattened to perfect smoothness. That's extraordinary, right? And I don't think Rembrandt's out there with a hammer. I think he's buying it from somebody, right? But it's still a fairly substantially sized print, even though Rembrandt likes prints that are about like this. That's sort of his preferred medium, although he's all over the map. And one of the things he'll do is, because he's very economical, he'll take prints that he's done with and he'll cut them up, flip them over, and use the back for something else. Because, the copper's got 2 sides, right? Why not? Yeah. Or trim the plate down because you think that the composition's not working right, or something. You need that piece of copper over here. And we know that he's got money problems all his life, right? Even though he's married rich. Okay, so anyway, this is a very, very large plate, and it's got this arched top as well, which is interesting, right? It's been particularly cut for a particular outline. And what Rembrandt's doing with this particular plate is, if you look at the early stuff from Leiden, his etching technique is really kind of stiff. It's just basically lines without a lot of variation to them, not a lot of cross-hatching, right? He's sort of just getting into it. And here, he's giving us the tonal range of a painting. He's really trying to push printmaking, a la Goltzius, to a higher art, to be as important as painting, right? And so this print, it really plays strongly into that, right? Into that idea. Now, it's also, one of the things we see when we look at Rembrandt is that he loves to take themes and work them again and again and again. He's never really done with these because he sees dramatic potential in these, right? So for him, I don't know about Rembrandt's faith. I guess it depends on your own faith whether or not you want him to have it, right? But he loves the Bible. But I think he loves the Bible as, first, it's a source of great stories. But second, it's also a source of things that people care enough about that they'll buy it. because he's got to sell this stuff at the same time, right? So going back to the same theme allows him to investigate it in a different kind of way, right? Even though it's very much the same thing. Christ goes over the grave of Lazarus, out he comes, right? The dead man walks. I guess it's the Walking Dead, right, of the 17th century. I love the difference in these two. Now, this is the difference in them, right? So we go from this to like this is part of that difference. But look at the wonderful little simplicity of economy of line. This little squiggle is here, it's down here, that give you that rock, and as opposed to the sort of extraordinary network of strokes that make up the larger plate, right? And that's because this is really embracing etching for what etching is. Whereas yours is trying to make etching into a painting almost, right? And blur the distinction between those. And part of what he's doing with that is he is taking his own composition and reworking it in print, right? Now, it's not exactly the same composition, right? But it's kind of the same thing seen from the other side, right? That, again, we've talked about this before with Goltzius, imagining figures in 3 dimensions, right? As you work, because sculptors had always said that, wow, we do 3 dimensions, but here Rembrandt is as well. And so many of the same figures sort of reappear, and instead of having the woman, with her hands out, we've got the guy back there with his hands out, and instead of seeing Jesus from this side, we see Jesus from the other side, and we see Lazarus looks pretty much the same in both of them, right? And so it's almost as if he's making a reproduction of his painting, but it's not a strict reproduction, right? It's an imaginative reproduction, which is exactly what he did with the later print, right? Are these imaginative reworkings of the theme because he's not done with it yet. And I think, we have artists in the room, right? Rework stuff because you're never done with it, right? The idea that you're done with something is ridiculous because you change. Your outlook changes. You're a different person tomorrow. Certainly you're a different person 10 years down the road. Go back and revisit that theme, right? All of the great artists of time have taken a single theme and reworked it. Right? Now, the other thing that's interesting about your choice, I'm trying to do this with almost everybody's prints, and what's cool about this, why don't we add something to that, right, is that this was done right around the time he's moving to Amsterdam. It's hard to say exactly when, but it reflects his ongoing dialogue with his studio partner. Remember that in Leiden, Rembrandt shared a studio with Jan Lievens, right? And in fact, we didn't look at it, but there's a nice little Jan Lievens head down at the National Gallery, right? There's a bust of a head. And during their time in the late 20s and right up to around 1630-31, their dialogue is really tight and multifarious, and there's a lot of prints where they're both doing the exact same thing, right, at exactly the same time. And there's a Lievens portrait of the raising of Lazarus from the same time period, right? These are being made in the same studio at the same time. And what you see happening when you look at Lievens and Rembrandt is that there's a rivalry here, right? And it's not a mean rivalry. It's a friendly rivalry. It's like, these are great ideas. Let's work with them, right? And so who's first and who's second, we don't know, right? I quite like Lievens's. I like the sweep of the winding cloth, right? That's the cloth, the burial cloth, and how that suggests resurrection. And also, I love the little. This is the zombie hands coming up out of the grave. You don't get the head or anything. You just get this little ghostly pair of hands coming out. I've always thought that was really cool about Lievens's work, right? So the two of them they're cross-fertilizing each other's ideas at this time. I think that's really a great thing about them. And it used to be we just thought of Lievens as following Rembrandt, but I don't think it's that way. I don't think it's that simple, right? I think that there's a back and forth rather than just Lievens picking up on what Rembrandt was doing, right? And the analogy for anybody who knows modern art is Picasso shared a studio when he was pioneering Cubism with another artist named George Braque. And it used to be we just thought Braque was aping everything Picasso did. But now we know that, hey, a lot of the ideas are coming from Braque, and Picasso sees their potential and does something with them. And I think that's kind of here too, right? Seeing the potential and doing something more with it, right? When Braque talked about Picasso, and forgive me if I already told you this, but when Braque talked about his time with Picasso, and this is relevant, I think, he said we were like mountain climbers, roped together, right? One would go up and set the mark, the other one would climb past him, right? And I think that's Rembrandt and Levens, exactly that scene. And Levens is doing etchings as well, right? So here's Levens' etched version of his raising of Lazarus, right, which has that same sweep of cloth, simple hands coming up. Jesus, and instead of dark, it's light, right? It's just the boom, the beam of light. And so that really puts a lot of context for your piece, right? There's a lot going on with this. I didn't choose these this way on purpose, Shelley, but there's yours as well. And it's because, in many ways, the ones that you get, this is the one that Shelley now chose. And the reason is that the first one, prints we're going to look at have this dialogue with painting, right? And with Rembrandt's painting. And these seem to be trying to give us prints that have a painterly quality, right? These ones in particular. So here's the angel coming to the shepherds in the fields to tell them that Jesus has been born, right? The Annunciation to the shepherds, or as it's often called, the angel appearing to the shepherds. And he tries to make this into a night piece, and he's doing the same thing he's doing in Jorge's print, which is a really deep network of cross-hatching that give us this extraordinary tonal range from light to dark. Unlike the entombment print that we saw, where the darkness is often plate tone, right, left on the flat surfaces. This is most of the darkness. I think he's done a bit more extensive wiping on the ground, but most of the darkness is coming from a network of lines, rather than from a painterly application of the printer's ink, right? And he gives us this range of things from the swirling Baroque angels in the heavens up above, with the dove of the Holy Spirit, right, coming down now with the angel and shining on the shepherd's emblem. And again, this is a fairly large, if I remember correctly, it's about like yay, right? It's not as big as that one, but it's big by comparison, right? And so Rembrandt is really, as he's working in Amsterdam and trying to make a career for himself, one of the things he's doing is he's again working with the idea of status, right, of importance. And both of these works are about the importance of etching as a pursuit for the artist. Now, your print, this one on the left, also picks up on other things that we've already talked about. One of them is the ongoing importance of Peter Lastman. Right? Remember that Rembrandt studied under Peter Lastman in Amsterdam around 1621 or so, right? Then had gone back 1621, 1624, and then he'd gone back to Leiden, set up shop with Levens, and then eventually moves to Amsterdam around 1630. Well, this is a totally different scene. It's a scene that Rembrandt will print as well, make a print of, where the angel's appearing to Tobit, or actually leaving away from Tobit. But look how similar these are. The pose of that angel coming down, right? This is an utter recollection of Peter Lastman. And how he knew this, if he made sketches from it, we're not 100% sure. We don't think he owned this picture, right? But we have to remember that through the course of his career, that 2 years he spent with Peter Lastman lasted, right? It really made, influenced a lot of his choices through a lot of his career. The other thing that's interesting about this, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, is remember that Peter Lastman had spent about 10 years in Rome, right? Had been working in Italy and had come back to Amsterdam, having sort of absorbed a lot of this new Baroque style in Rome, right? He'd seen Caravaggio's and whatnot. There were other artists that were there with him, and one of the artists that was there that he seems to have known while he was in Rome, Lastman, was a German artist named Adam Elsheimer. And Elsheimer was a specialist, Jorge, in night scenes. Right? did quite a few images of biblical scenes at night. In fact, this one, I've read, is the very first painting anywhere where we can see the Milky Way, right? Where we can actually see constellations in the sky that are accurate, right? Which is pretty cool. And it's the flight into Egypt. So this is the Holy Family, right, leaving Herod's troops, trying to keep Jesus from getting massacred with all those babies by all those nude soldiers, right? But he gives it to us as a night scene. And that seems to have had a huge influence on Rembrandt and his interest in darkness, right? Because again, the Lastman thing is so huge, right? Lastman introduces him to these nocturnal images, right? And there were prints after this that were available to Rembrandt. And we know that Rembrandt had this monster print collection, right? And in fact, remember the plate that we saw in the Rijksmuseum that was a Hercules Sager print that Rembrandt had doctored the plate and came up with his own? So it was Tobit and the Angel, and then it got flipped over to be the Holy Family on the flight into Egypt. Remember that? Side by side? Well, that Sager's print was actually after an Elsheimer composition. It was a copy of an Elsheimer's composition. So these connections are sort of everywhere, right? So your image brings up all sorts of like cool other things about Rembrandt, right, that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Speaking of big, Thomas chose this one, right? One of his biggest plates, right? And this one is an interesting thing as well for a number of different reasons. One is that it's one of only 2 prints he made that have a particular kind of signature. So when Rembrandt signs, and he signs almost everything, he'll sign it anything from just RDT, right, abbreviation of Rembrandt, to Rembrandt and the date, to Rembrandt made this, Fekete, and the date, right? And all sorts of, but there's only 2 of them that say Rembrandt cum privilege, with privilege. In other words, I'm the only one who can print this, right? With privilege. So he's claiming copyright. Now, the 17th century, it was easy for people to lift things, and we see a lot of people. We just saw Rembrandt lifting motifs from that. This one says Rembrandt with privilege, right? Meaning I have the lone solitary privilege to print this image, right? And there's only one of 2 that he did, and they're the two of his biggest prints, right? And they're also 2 of his prints that rival paintings. This one has exactly what the other 2 do, which is that attempt through the network of lines, right, to give us something that seems like a painting, even though it's a black and white print. And to get to this plate, Rembrandt actually made a painting of it in tones of gray, right? This is in London. So he went up and worked up the composition in paint, right, to get the sense of how he wanted the plate to be toned. And then from this, he then sketched on the plate, right, transferred it over, and that's why it then reverses, because of the printing process, right? So this tells us that Rembrandt is really trying to make a painted print, if you will, right? A print that is like a painting. And that accounts for the sort of tightness of rendering. Not a lot of that fast, sketchy line that we've seen in other prints, right? It's not trying to be a print, if that makes sense. It's trying to be a painting, right? And if we think about the one you're writing about, right, this is trying to be a print. Everything about the later Christ before Pilate is very much about printmaking. The lines don't attempt to give us painterly tone. In fact, with this print, Rembrandt didn't even use etching. He got into this idea that all you got to do is change the surface of the plate, right? So what he did was he took his etching needle. I'm going to use my pen. You have a needle, right? That's how you draw through the wax, is the sharp little needle. And he just took that thing and just started scratching at the plate, right? Not unlike Goldsmith's carving, right? But he's just scratching at the plate. And I think, using a straight edge, right? The base under Jesus is no way. And even if you look at the right, you can see that he sort of mapped it out using a straight edge, right? Scratching in the plate. And it's called dry point. And what that does that's different, you may know this from your plastic plate, right? But on a copper plate, as even with plexi, right? What dry point does, when Goltzius carves, right, he's got the beer in the carves, he ends up flecking off metal. Little pieces of metal will be around the sides of it because he's cutting it out, right? These little toenail clippings, right? They look like end up around the plate of copper. With dry point, the metal that's displaced when you draw stays on the plate, right? It's hooked into the plate. So it's like a plow in the dirt. You cut a line and you leave a hill next to it, right? Because it's still there. Now you can come back and you can scrape it off if you wanted to, but he doesn't, because what happens is that the burr, right, grabs the ink. We heard about this a couple times, right? And so that counts for that velvety thickness that you see there. Sometimes Rembrandt will add dry point lines to an etching, just to get some accents. This is entirely dry point. And so is the Three Crosses. Right? Both of those are entirely dry point. And if you've ever done dry point on copper, there's a couple of things. One is etching, wax, you have a much more fluid line. Dry point with the resistance, it's harder to do that. I get the feeling that Rembrandt must have had hands like like a Boston Strangler or something. Must have been muscular hands in his forearms, because if you look at these things, some of the lines that are there are carved so extraordinarily deeply, right? And there just has to be a certain amount of sort of, forearm strength to make that work, right? But the difference here, of course, is that Thomas's print is this very attempt to be painted, right? And the later print is certainly where he's embracing printmaking for how it's different from painting, rather than elevate printing to be like painting, right? The other print that says with privilege is this one, the Descent from the Cross, right? And it's also huge, right? So these are the only two. And it's also directly related to a painting, right? So this one is what we would call a reproductive print. The Christ before Pilate, not really, because the painting served the print. Does that make sense? That Grisaille painting was made specifically as a step to arrive at the print. This print was made specifically to provide people with copies of a famous painting. And there are numerous instances in the history of printmaking where this was perfectly acceptable, right? A souvenir copy. We buy postcards. We don't anymore because we use email, but you buy an umbrella, right? Or an earring with the girl with the pearl earring on it or something like that, right? We buy souvenirs. This would have been similar to a sort of a high art souvenir, right? A poster for the home. And the painting is one we looked at when we talked about Rembrandt, which is one of the paintings that he had done for Frederick Hendrik, the stadhouder, right? The stateholder, the leader of the Netherlands, right? The military leader. He'd done a series of 6 paintings for him. And this was one of the first ones he had done. He'd sent it off to be approved, and it got approved. And so he makes a reproductive version of it, right? This is a status piece. It's all about status, right? So our first paintings here are really trying to rival, our first prints here are really trying to rival paintings as being as close to them as they possibly can in overall painterly effect. Right? I brought this in because we were at the National Gallery on Sunday, and I saw Maeve looking at this and spending some time with this. So this is down in the National Gallery, and I think Rembrandt used these prints as teaching tools as well, right? And there's an interesting thing about how Rembrandt approaches printmaking, that he doesn't see it locked into its own little corner. That he sees it as being like a sketchbook. He sees it as being like a model for students to use and copy, as much as his own paintings might have been, right? And so this one used to float around as a Rembrandt. Now, based on paint application and whatnot, we see it as Rembrandt circle. And I think on a certain level, the body of Christ is a sort of a emulation of that print, rather than looking back to Rembrandt's original painting and become an intermediary for teaching. Right? Jesse liked this one, right? The Ship of Fortune. Again, this is early in his career, his first few years in Amsterdam, right? And what's interesting about this, and the reason I put it here, even though it's much more sketchy, is that it's also a commercial print, if you will, right? Rather than a fine art print, right? It's something that has a sort of commercial, a real prominent commercial role to play, right? This one was a commissioned piece. Did you know about that? Did you read?
I read about it.
Okay, tell me about it. What did you read?
It's the Ship of Fortune, and I think the woman on the boat is Lady Fortune.
Lady Fortune herself. That's
and
right.
It's supposed to represent that the Dutch are more prosperous when
That's
they're
right.
at peace.
That's right.
But I also the statue in the back kind of looks like Rembrandt. So
It is Rembrandt.
It
It is very much. Okay, great. That's excellent. So this was actually commissioned for a book,
Yeah.
right?
The horse confuses me a little.
Well, we'll talk about that, right? We'll talk about this. So it's a commission for a book that told the history of the world through a series of naval events, right? So just limited perspective world history, right? That the history of the world, and for the Dutch in the 17th century, this is important, right? Because their prominence is because of their naval power, right? And they rule the world because of the sea. So it's an important thing.
Yeah.
And this particular event, now there are multiple illustrations in here, but this is the only one by Rembrandt. And the only reason anybody pays attention to this book anymore is because of this print, right, that Rembrandt did as a commercial book illustration. It's one of 2 or 3 times he did this, made commercial book illustrations, right? So it's a commissioned piece, unlike the other ones that he's doing for himself. But it falls into that whole commercial thing, okay? So Lady Fortune is taking a boat off to the calm seas because peace has fallen, right? War has ended. And the person at the helm of the boat is Neptune, the god of the sea, sort of guiding the rudder as well. We see him from the back, right? Now, you had mentioned the horse kind of confuses you. Again, there's connections to his paintings. This is a scene from the Old Testament. Balaam is this old fool. I can't remember what biblical book he's in, but he can't control his donkey, right? And the donkey just keeps trying to fight against him. And that basic composition, Rembrandt has translated into this, even though the subject matter has changed entirely, right? So can you see the similarity here, right? The kneeling donkey, the figure on the back with his arms out to the side, right? This is all derived from this earlier composition that Rembrandt's work. So there's this fluid interchange, right, between his prints and his paintings. But they're rarely copies, right? That deposition from the cross is one of the rarities, right? They're rethinkings, right, and reuses of motifs. The other thing is that it reminds us of Lastmann again. Peter Lastmann was just so important for Rembrandt. We see it again and again and again. And this was painted when Rembrandt was in his studio, right? And there's Balaam and the ass, and you can see that Rembrandt's recalling this, right? He's turned that figure into this guy on this falling horse. So what's going on? How does it fit the theme? Do you know? I'll tell you.
Is it supposed to represent the war or
the
war?
end of war, right? So a horse is a war animal. This horse is shagged out. This horse is exhausted. He's done. He's kneeling down. So war is ending, right? And the guy who's on it, you can see there's a laurel wreath in his hair. It's a Roman, right? It's meant to be Augustus, Caesar Augustus. Now, if you know your Roman history, Augustus was the first emperor of Rome, right? He's at that transition point from Rome being a republic, representative government, to Rome being an empire, inherited government, right? But, and he's like the nephew, or maybe grandnephew of Caesar, right? So he's the one after the Civil War. So Caesar's knifed, right? Caesar's knifed in the Forum because he claimed too much power, right? Or he refused to disavow power when people wanted to give it to him. That's more or less what it was, right? It wasn't he claimed it. He said other people claimed it for him, and he didn't say no, right? And you know this from Julius Caesar, from Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
right? So he's knifed on the floor of the Senate in the Forum, and buried, and he's a huge hero to the Romans now, but at the time. And it led to a civil war. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, right, all of that. And at the end of the Civil War, Augustus, his nephew, right, rises to power and becomes emperor for life and associated with the gods. Okay? One of the things that happened under Augustus was that Rome was able to, through his military leadership, conquer the majority of its enemies. This included, in principle, primarily, it was France and Spain. Right? These were the big enemies that they conquered. Although they're never really at peace, but they conquered. This was a big problem. And Augustus conquers them. And it ushers in a period that the Romans referred to as the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. Started with Augustus. And they said lasted for 200 years, which is a kind of a fiction, right? But nonetheless, Peace of Rome has begun under Augustus. So this is Augustus at the beginning of allegorically, at the beginning of the Peace of Rome, right? So the kneeling horse is war ending, the ship, which allows the ship of fortune to sail under clear skies and calm seas, right? And as you mentioned, yes, the woman there, right, is meant to be an allegorical figure. That accounts for why she's naked, right? You get unaccounted for naked figures in compositions, then they're usually allegorical figures, right? And this is true back into Roman art as well, but I can show you hundreds of examples of naked broads who don't belong there, right? Unlike Cornelis van Haarlem, who gave us those naked soldiers, but they're really there. He's just showing off his ability to do naked figures, right? Okay. So naked figures who don't belong are almost entirely allegorical. I love how he signed it as if it were on the ship, like nailed to the side of the, or dated at least, right? And the figure with his back to us and his arm up, that's Neptune, holding the tiller, right, of the boat. So here, smooth sailing, right? And over behind Alexander, we have people laying down their arms, right? And the poem, this is a book of poems, talks about the fact that they laid down their arms and they picked up musical instruments, right? I don't know, I looked at this to see if I could see any musical instruments, and I can't, right? But nonetheless, this also amplifies the poem that this was meant to illustrate. And as you mentioned, you're absolutely right. That's him. There's Rembrandt as the statue, right? The statue is Janus. Do you know who Janus is?
Two-faced Roman god.
Two-faced Roman god, exactly right. He's why we named January after him, because one face looks back, the other face looks forward, right? So he's not two-faced side to side, but it's front and back. He sees the past, he sees the future. That's January, the turning of the new year. Right? It's named after Janus. And according to the poem, Janus' statue has one of the faces well refined, in other words, finished, and the other face is unfinished, right? So this is meant to be a temple of Janus. And I was trying to work this out in my mind, what this all means. They're closing the temple. But I don't know about the temple of Janus and what it might have symbolized. Does two-facedness and the idea of a past and a future say that maybe now there's only a future? And we're turning our back on the war, which is the past, and we're looking only toward the future. Therefore, we're closing this temple to the God who looks both ways. Maybe, right? That's sort of what I got out of it, right? So, good choice. Although I've never spent any time with this, right? I just found this goofy...
It's just fascinating.
Yeah. They're all fascinating. I mean, every one of these things holds something to sort of really dive into. And by the way, almost all of these, there's an impression done at the National Gallery. You can make an appointment to go see it, right? They'll pull it out for you, give you a magnifying glass. You don't need me, right? You can do this on your own. Matt chose Joseph telling his dreams, right? And this is another print that has some relationship to some of Rembrandt's other works. So in the same show, there was a grisaille painting, another of these gray tone paintings, monochrome paintings of this same scene. And you can see it's not a direct copy. Unlike Thomas's, where the painting was definitely a prep for that, right? This one, the painting is beginning to work things out, but as he reworks it, many of the same characters stay there. The old lady in the bed, right? The pose of Who's he telling his dreams to? Is it Pharaoh?
Yes.
Yeah? The old man with his foot on the book. It may be one of Pharaoh's own prophets, right? Rather than Pharaoh himself. It doesn't look at all Egyptian, you know. But Joseph is the kid, right? Who's now explaining his dreams. But if you look at the pose of the old bearded man here, who we've seen in other Rembrandts, right? Remember the Jeremiah who sees Jerusalem burn? Looks just like that guy. And in fact, the composition kind of looks like that as well, right? But there he is leaning into this. And I love the dog, by the way, in both of these, is curled up in the corner. I think he's licking himself in Matt's print, right? Rembrandt loves these he loves making things normal. Does that make sense? Like taking these special one-off biblical stories and turning them into just like, yeah, I might see that on my Thursday. You know, Maeve.
It's also really interesting with the way the title is. You don't really know if Joseph is telling his dreams, like his own dreams, or he saw him reflecting his dreams.
Yeah. I would be careful with doing too much with the titles because Rembrandt didn't title them himself, right? Those are curators' titles that come from trying to categorize these things for us. And so I think if you go back to the biblical story, it becomes more clear, which I'm no good at either.
I mean, he originally was telling his dreams from jail.
But because I know he's in jail, and I know, or not in jail, but it's sort of like in captivity, right? And I know that one of the dreams is the ladder, right? Jacob's ladder. But I'd have to go back into whatever book of the Old Testament this is. Rembrandt loves the Old Testament, almost more than the New Testament, because the stories are better, right? The stories are much more emotional in a way, right? They're much more visceral. I mean, he doesn't ignore the New Testament by any means, right? But the Old Testament offers these sort of extraordinarily questionable behavior, you know, that allows us to get into the heart of humanity. Well, look at King David. He screws up all the time, right? He makes a mistake after mistake, and yet he's forgiven by God, right? And many of our Old Testament figures are just these figures who are out there and they're just screwing it up right, left, and center. And I think Rembrandt likes that, right? That insight into the fallibility of human activity, and so. Anyway, it seems to approach him. In looking at this, I became interested in a couple of things. Looking at first was obviously a connection to this painting that's also there. The painting wound up in the collection of one of his students, Ferdinand Boll, who's one of the guys that worked on the Royal Palace. The first day we were there, we saw a painting by Ferdinand Boll there. And I looked through what I could find of paintings by Boll to see if he did copies of this, and he didn't. He made a painting of the same subject matter, but it doesn't look like this, right? So it would be cool if he did, because he was a Rembrandt pupil, right? And he seems to have inherited it from Rembrandt or been given it as a gift. This is a very sketchy painting, right? But even in the sketchiness, look at this figure here, right? He's able to sort of capture this, how do people converse, and how do you make a body language that tells a story of that you can hear, you know? And Rembrandt is so good at it. This is this group of three figures over here on the left, as they're listening to Joseph telling his dreams. I also became very interested in the old woman in the bed, right, in the back of both of these, especially in the print, where she takes on a very particular look. And then it just reminded me so much of these drawings he made of Saskia when she was sick. Right? And this looks just like her, doesn't it? Even the placement of the hand right on the side of her head. Right? Can you see that? It's over here. Her head is just up here. Right? That he's using these this is going to be the most traumatic time of his life, right? And this one, it's a quill pen, right? A very thick sort of reed pen is what he's using here. And it looks like he's also just rubbing it with his hand while the ink is still wet to get some of the lines that we see around it. But there she is, dying of tuberculosis, or early stages of it anyway, and laying in bed, and he's turned it now into that. I'm absolutely sure that that's the basis of this, right? And I just wanted to bring in some of these other images of maybe Saskia. We're not 100% sure, right? Prints that he did. And a couple things I wanted to point out with these. One is that First, there's a connection between the figures he uses in his pictures and the people around him. Although it's not ever not really one-to-one, right? But I asked you guys to look for Rembrandt's mom, right? That idea, right? But the other thing I wanted to point to, something we've been talking about today, is how some of these prints are painterly, thoroughly worked up. And some of them look like unfinished sketches, right? That he's just happy to go in, that's it, I'm done. And the mark making in this is extraordinary. And some of the lines are very, very deeply etched, or maybe even dry pointed, right, around her headdress here. But then other ones are just these wonderful sort of, like, you ever gone to a stationery store and you pick up a pen and they got the little place to draw, you could write, you just do that, right? And that's exactly what he's doing. He's got these great little drawings. And he seems like he looks at many of his prints as finished composition. He looks at some other ones as if they're like sketchbook pages. He's working out ideas, right? And there had to have been a market for these, because they're not like, right, he's making the plate. And he's wiping it clean, he's cleaning it off, and he's inking it, and he's printing multiple versions. Somebody had to want this, right? I would want it, right? But there's a market for these, independent from the connection they have to the more finished works. There are a couple of etching plates that are extraordinary in the fact that they look just like the way you treat a print plate or a sketchbook page. Right, you turn it this way, you draw something, and I'm not, it's just a sketch, I don't really care. Turn it over here, it's not a finished work of art. So we got a couple of beggars wandering the streets down there, two different images, two more above them, right, an old lady up there, and then two different images of Saskia in bed, right? One vertical and one horizontal, and another little face down below. And these all are, the date on this, I wonder now, seeing Joseph telling his dreams, whether or not that's too late of a date, right? And it doesn't relate more closely back to really what we're looking at here. Right? Madeline chose these, and she's not here, but I'm here in recording, and this will be the last ones we look at, right? She chose both of these this Holy Family image on the left, really cute. I love Joseph back in this book, right? He's a busy man. His job is to protect them, right? So he's dutiful, right? Alert. And the fact that the Virgin Mary looks at us, right? Not a lot of step etching here, right? Not a lot of changes in the depth of the line, right? Not a lot of surface tone. It's a very straightforward image. She's kicked off her shoe, right? You see the cute little thing. She's got a little slipper, and the slipper's down there. You see her toes. Big, fat Madonna feet, right? And the one on the right, which I've always loved this image on the right, the Virgin and Child with the cat and the snake. So there's Mary and Jesus, they're cuddling as can be. Little kitty cat next to the chair that she's not sitting in. And underneath her feet is a snake, right? Now, a couple things I'd like to point to. And one of them is that chair and the cat, right? The fact that she's not sitting in the chair is not necessarily an innovation on Rembrandt's part. We see a lot of Renaissance images, Rembrandt would have probably known of these through his studies and whatnot, of the Virgin Mary sitting on the ground as opposed to on a chair. And the whole idea is to show her humble. It became known as the Madonna of humility, right? Seated on the ground rather than on anything that might resemble a throne. Even though she's the Virgin Mary, and, right, she deserves it. She merits it. She knows it's hers. She's going to be Queen of Heaven, and she knows that from day one. But she chooses to sit on the floor. Right? I had to look up the cat, because part of me thinks, okay, cats fight, anger, sin, Madonna, Jesus, peace. Sort of that idea. But I found out that there's a biblical passage that mentions that at the birth of Christ, there was a cat that gave birth to some kittens. And I didn't know this, but that may be what that cat's doing back there, right, as a reference to the birth of Christ. If we look closely at her, we see the snake now, right, under her feet. That's definitely a symbol of sin, that the Madonna has, Virgin Mary has conquered sin by giving birth to the Savior. Right? So it's a reference back to the Garden of Eden. When we were down at the National Gallery, we saw a snake with a human face on it, right? This is now theology in the Renaissance and onward referred very regularly to the Virgin Mary as the new Eve. Created by God, right? Sent here to earth. Eve screws it up. The Madonna fixes it. Jesus is the new Adam, right? Adam screws it up. Jesus fixes it, right? So that idea of her being the new Eve is picked up in this image as she steps on the snake. But it's also, and I think this is really fascinating, a common theme that we see in Catholic images. So this is Vermeer. This is up at the Met. It's probably the worst Vermeer painting. In fact, our curator here said to the curator there one time in the class I was in grad school, the curator up there, he died a few years ago. He said, Vermeer never had a Monday painting. And the curator from the National Gallery said, oh, yes, he did, and you own it. And it was this one. It's an allegory. It's not his best stuff, right? His best stuff are these genre scenes, right? This is an allegory of Catholicism. So she's leaning, right? All these trappings of Catholicism. Because his wife was Catholic. Had Catholic patrons, right? And there's a snake crushed by a stone down here. Right? So Rembrandt's picking up the same thing, and I'm wondering if he's not targeting Catholic audiences. He's trying to be a savvy businessman, right? He really wants to sell prints. So why not pull in some traditional Catholic elements? The last thing, and then we'll quit. I love Joseph in this. Outside the window, like lurking. It's kind of creepy in a way, isn't it? It's like from Scream or something like that, right? He's back there looking at, but I think it's also kind of wonderful in a way, because if we think about Joseph and the whole point of Joseph, what's the point of Joseph? Well, she doesn't need him. That's a great feminist statement. She does not need Joseph, right? She's God, her, Jesus, that's it, right? So what is Joseph's role? Joseph's role is to protect her, right? That's it. It's to protect her from shame of being a unwed mother, right? But also to protect them from potential harm, right? That's his role. And we saw him in that other part, right? But here, looking in from the outside, he's dutiful, right? He's still just sort of there. He's always there. Right? But at the same time, he's not dad. I mean, he's not really physically. He's dad, but he's not sire, right? And so there's this idea of separating, right? So he is the stepfather of Jesus, but he's not the physical father of Jesus. So here she is, cuddling the newborn. And Joseph is there, but he's not there, right? And again, I think Rembrandt's very aware of traditions that we often see images of the Annunciation. This is where Jesus is being born. There's Joseph, and he's there, but he's not there, right? He's in another room, in the dark, right? In this case, he's outside. So Rembrandt's picking up on these ideas. Okay, well, we'll look at more Rembrandt prints on Friday, and I think next Tuesday we'll probably look at Frans Hals more closely, because we got such great pictures of him downtown. Talk a little bit more about him. We'll sort of use the rest of the class to hit on some of the heavy hitters and some of the themes that we've been talking about.